Welcome, everybody. If this is the first time that you're listening to one of my webinars, I just wanted to frame up this topic for you. It is on strategic thinking, and this is a continuation of our series on communication and thinking styles, particularly for auditors and people in risk management. And our prior webinars dealt with influence and critical thinking. And all of these conversations and your questions prompted me to continue the research, and now this session will be focusing on strategic thinking. And what you're looking at is the agenda for today. A couple of things before I walk you through the agenda. I want to underscore that there are 5 polling questions, and they are a little non-traditional, so I hope you'll have a little fun with them. Normally when you take a webinar, the polling questions ask you to regurgitate what you just heard, and we're using them in a little bit of a novel way here, looking to get your thinking on the subject, looking to use it a little bit like a needs assessment. 2 of the polling questions are actually mini case studies, so you can see how you're able to apply what we'll be talking about today. So the scope of this webinar will cover a definition of strategic thinking, and we'll be differentiating it from critical thinking. And we'll also be talking about, well, what's the difference between strategic planning and strategic thinking, and what's the relationship of strategic thinking to strategic planning. We'll talk about the benefits of strategic thinking, but we'll also talk about what are the behaviors. How do you recognize someone who's thinking strategically? And then how is strategic thinking relevant to the work that we're doing in internal audit? And I wanted to give you a couple of examples from a practical perspective in terms of how you could use this information. I also wanted to include in this program some specific techniques that you as an individual could use to build your own ability to think strategically. You might want to view it as like a career development enhancement. And I also included some techniques for those of you who are responsible for bench strength development in terms of how can we develop strategic thinking as a core competency for the people in our department. So that's the scope of what we'll be talking about. And as we move along, if you have any questions, definitely write them down, send them in, and we'll look to answer as many of the questions as we can. In the event that it becomes 60 minutes and we haven't gotten to all of the questions, I'll get answers back to you following the webinar via email. So with that said, let's get started with a polling question. And I'm asking you, what do you think? Strategic thinking is analytical, futuristic, causally oriented, or all of the above? So make your choice, and then we will talk about the answers.
And Anne, while everybody's answering that question, I have a question for you that people might be interested in. Do you think strategic thinking is something that requires a disciplined learning process, or do you think some people are better at it than others? Just
Laura,
born
I can't
that
believe
way.
you asked me that because I was thinking about that this morning. I was just thinking, I think that for some people it might seem to be more natural. It might come more naturally, but I do think that it can be learned. And I've been thinking that the folks for whom it comes more naturally, they might also have just seen it modeled more frequently. Because we do tend to emulate the thought patterns of the people to whom we report. I mean, if we're smart individuals, we get these little review notes. And if we're smart, we try to learn from them. So if you're fortunate enough to be working for somebody who is strategic, you might not realize you're modeling that behavior, but you're really learning it. I think it can go either way, but I definitely think it can be learned. Do you think we got enough responses in?
I do. I think we've shown the poll results.
Okie dokie. So 84%, almost 85% of the population is absolutely brilliant. in saying that it's all of the above, and I would say that elements of these three things are in strategic thinking. I think that the best answer, though, is futuristic. Let me walk you through some of the choices because I can almost hear people say, what? Why isn't the answer all of the above, even though almost 85% of the respondents thought that it was? If you chose analytical, that means really carefully, in a detailed way, thinking about things. Maybe what you meant when you checked analytical was systematic, meaning methodical. In which case, okay, I would agree. I would agree that strategic thinking is more systematic than it is even analytical. It's definitely futuristic. In fact, that's probably one of its distinguishing characteristics. The causal orientation is actually more correlated to critical thinking because root cause is one of the manifestations of critical thinking. So the best answer, I would say the best answer, would be futuristic. So let's take a look at the definition of strategic thinking. It's your capacity, your ability to think conceptually, so thinking about ideas, imaginatively. I know we're using imagination and audit in the same sentence. Can you believe it? Systematically, meaning, as I said earlier, methodically, thinking about different categories, thinking about different scenarios, and opportunistically. Now, that might be a word we don't think about or associate with audit all that often, but really what we're trying to say is how can we capitalize, make decisions that we can capitalize on. It includes the ability to anticipate. Probably anticipation is most closely correlated with strategic thinking, meaning being able to think a couple of steps ahead. So being able to anticipate the impact of potential decisions and evaluate this in terms of the long term, not just the short term. So that's a definition. If I were to continue the definition, when you are thinking strategically, you're probably a really good game player. You can anticipate, if I move here, this is what the fallout's going to be down the road. It also means that you're thinking with a long-term construct or a long-term context when you are making your decisions. So it's while I said earlier, I could see people making arguments to say that each of those terms, analytical, causal related, are attributes of strategic thinking. Really, when you look at the definitions that I've just gone through with you, the undercurrent that's tying it all together is future-oriented. Someone who is a strategic thinker is definitely thinking about where this decision will leave us. What will it position us to do? Or conversely, how will this decision hamstring us and prevent us from moving ahead? Now, I mentioned critical thinking as different from strategic thinking, so I would like your thinking on this polling question. True or false? Strategic thinking involves critical thinking. Critical thinking does not involve strategic thinking. It's almost like a little mental tongue twister for today. So which do you think it is?
And Anne, while they're answering, we have another question. And this person, let me read through it, wants to know is why strategic thinking is so important to auditing.
So I am going to answer that question later on in the webinar, but I would tell you right now, just very fundamentally, audits are time-bound. Once you use the time, you can't get it back. How are you going to most opportunistically use the time allocated when you're planning an audit? I'm just using that as one simple example. And I think in order to plan audits effectively, strategic thinking really comes into play. You have to be able to anticipate, okay, if we do this, if we look at these areas, and we don't look at other areas, if we spend our time this way, not that way, what will that buy us? What will that get us? So that's one example of how to use strategic thinking in audit. So I guess it's time to look at the answer. What do you think?
I think so.
So we have it split, almost split. 53% think it's true, and about 47, just shy of 47.5%. Those of you that said it was true, you're right. You're absolutely right. There is an evaluative component in strategic thinking, meaning the evaluative component is this something that we should do? Will it help us meet our long-term goals? That's the evaluative component. Critical thinking, however, you don't have to be strategic at all when you're thinking critically, because you can just analyze and analyze. You can parse out. You can subdivide, stratify. You can dig yourself into a mental hole, and that's fine. But do all of that without necessarily considering where that will leave you in terms of the future. So let's take a closer look at the differences and similarities between critical and strategic thinking. If you were part of the earlier webinar on critical thinking, you know that it is evaluative, definitely. Root cause analysis is one of the major ways we manifest critical thinking. It's definitely analytical. Largely, what are the patterns, what's the same, what's different. In comparison, strategic thinking is creative, it's big picture oriented, and it's futuristic. So both of them are important. Both of them are important, and both of them are necessary. But I can be a strategic thinker without being, as critical a thinker. But it's possible, very possible, to think critically without being strategic at all. Now, frequently, I have found that some folks confuse strategic planning and strategic thinking. Maybe confuse is too strong a word. They think they're the same. They think that if you are a strategic planner, therefore you are a strategic thinker. And I would say, well, not necessarily, not necessarily. The terminology, strategic planning, is an activity in and of itself. It's generally an annual one. It's generally one where the leadership in your organization get together. For those of you who are on fiscal year ending 12/31, now is a very popular time of year for leadership in the organizations to get together and develop their future-looking plans. Where are we going to be in 3 years? And what do we need to do over the interim years to get us to realize this vision? Part of strategic planning means that the leaders within the organization or the process owners within the organization get together and they figure out and they evaluate what their SWOT'S are. And for those of you that are not familiar with the acronym SWOT'S, it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you do your homework before you get to this event, and you think about your strengths and your weaknesses organizationally, with an eye towards the outside world, with a view towards the external environment, with a view towards the competition, not only thinking about your own internal capability. The strengths and the weaknesses, these are the things you do well and the things that your organization does not do so well, basically in the current environment, thinking about the next 12 months or so. When you then start to consider your organizational opportunities and threats, these are more futuristically oriented. When you think about opportunities, available software might be an opportunity. Threats are things that are out there that could literally cause a problem for the organization with an eye towards the future. So one of the threats out there, if you've been looking at just trends in the media, particularly media written for auditors and risk managers, cybersecurity is being touted as one of the most serious threats out there looming in the future, not just a current threat, but one that could be with us for a while. So this is part of the strategic planning initiative. Now, basically, when we're doing strategic thinking, we're using this on an ongoing basis throughout the year. Strategic planning is isolated to generally one point in time during the year, although work against that plan might occur throughout the year. The plan itself is developed typically at a point in time. However, strategic thinking is something that people can use on an ongoing basis several times a day, and it's definitely more widespread. This is not just localized to an individual. On the comparative side, how are they the same? Well, both of them, and I think this is probably why they get a little confused or mentally mashed together, both require a futuristic orientation. You know, we have to be looking forward. Both require the individuals involved to think about the world at large, not just what is going on inside the four walls of the organization. Both put pressure on your business knowledge, your business acumen. The more you understand the process, the more you understand the competitive landscape, the more you understand the technology that's being used, you really have an advantage when you're thinking strategically or when you're coming up with a strategic plan. The terminology systematic thinking, this is now probably the second or third time you're seeing this in the presentation, and this is associated with thinking in a methodical, comprehensive manner. So now we've talked about what it is. We've talked about what strategic planning is. I think that going back to that question, Lark, what's the benefit and how do we use it in audit, I think that we should probably tackle this information now. So some of the benefits, it does start a conversation. If you start looking towards the future, let's face it, no one really knows what the future is going to bring. So if you start exchanging perspectives on these futuristic scenarios, it does start a conversation. It also can create some chances, can create some opportunities to do things that are not currently being done. And I also think it's a way to leverage experience within the department and learn. So things that have gone well, if you're a strategic thinker, you would say, wow, the last time we did this audit, it really was like a warm knife through butter. Everything went so smoothly. We had very little resistance with regard to the issues that we identified. What happened? Why did it work so smoothly? A strategic thinker would look to leverage whatever was done in that audit and project it forward. How do we get more people doing that? Similarly, if the audit was like the audit from hell, okay, what happened there? Now, granted, that's a little critical thinking going on. What's the root cause? But the strategic part is, okay, how can we leverage this? How can we share this knowledge so that other people don't make that same misstep that we did? I also think that when you are thinking strategically and when you are encouraging others to think strategically, not only does it start a conversation, but it really becomes very clear that there's more than one way to achieve long-term results. And I think that's a really terrific thing, because the more options you have, the more successful you'll be. Now, the last comment about it creates the perception that strategic thinkers are adaptable. I included this because I was thinking, well, some of you might be listening, not so much thinking about the benefits of strategic thinking for your department, but what are the benefits of strategic thinking for me as an individual? And I have been in conversations with people who are strategic, and they bring up a point that just opens up the conversation. And I've noticed the reaction of others at the meeting. Others are like, wow, I didn't think about that. Wow, that's a new way of looking at it. So getting that wow factor associated with you and your performance, I see that as an individual benefit of demonstrating strategic thinking. So you now know what strategic thinking is. You know how it differs from critical thinking and how it differs from strategic planning and what the benefits are for doing it. So now what I'd like you to think about is the behaviors of people who demonstrate strategic thinking. So I'd like you to respond to this poll question. I'd like you to think about strategic thinkers that you know, and I'd like you to determine whether a strategic thinker is politically savvy, futuristic, anticipatory, opportunistic, none of these things, or all of these things.
So, Anne, one of the questions that's come in, it might be good to answer while they're answering this particular polling question. And this person's asking, is it possible to appraise or measure how effectively an internal audit applies strategic thinking?
I am, by training, a behavioralist, meaning it's not so much the degrees or the education that you have, it's what you do. So philosophically, I believe we can measure just about anything. So my answer would be, yeah, I think that we can start to look at certain conditions, whatever that condition might be. Maybe it's audit cycle time, maybe it's report issuance time, maybe it's the time needed to plan, maybe it's results, coverage of the area. I think if we just define the target, think about our current condition, and approach it behaviorally, yeah, I think we can measure the impact that thinking ahead, anticipating, is going to have.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that.
So let's see what you came up with. And I am just looking to see. Fantastic. 72% of you, almost 72.5% of you, felt that it was all of the above, and that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I didn't know how some of you might react to seeing the term politically savvy there, but that is definitely a characteristic of strategic thinkers. So going back to the question, Lark, about, can you measure things? Can you measure somebody's political savvy? I don't know if you can measure the savvy. You can certainly measure when they're not savvy. So one way or another, we could be able to get some sense of, are we moving in the right direction? We've already talked about being futuristic as an attribute of strategic thinking, so clearly that should have been included in your definition of a behavior for strategic thinkers. And if you had thought about the definition of strategic thinking earlier in this webinar, that should have helped you figure out opportunistic with regard to goal achievement, specifically long-term goal achievement, and it's definitely a characteristic. So let's look a little more closely at these behaviors. And as we look at these behaviors, here's what I would do if I were you participating in the webinar. I would be asking myself silently, do I display this behavior? And then if the answer comes back yes, do I display it consistently? Meaning, do I display it when I am working with peers? Do I display it when I'm working with my boss or my direct report? Do I display it when I'm working with clients? Because it's really the consistency. So the first attribute in terms of key behaviors is leadership. And I am using the term leadership here in the informal sense, not the formal sense, meaning a staff auditor in a meeting with SVP client could display leadership because we're talking about the ability to set direction, to communicate direction. They're also able to keep people focused on the long view. I don't know if you've ever been on a project or a review where people get so caught up in the current work that they are doing that they completely lose track of time. And they could spend a day, day and a half, dare I say it, 2 days on the same activity, not picking their head up and saying, excuse me, where's the value? You know, is this really strategically the best use of the time that I'm allocating to this audit? If you are able to keep people focused on the long view, you are helping others you're helping prevent others from being tunnel visioned and very narrow in their perspective. I also think that a key behavior of strategic thinkers is that they really get innovation going. And I want to pause because I think sometimes if I use words like innovation, or if I use words like, oh, you'll be creative, I think we might start thinking about art classes, you know, and people might pause and say, well, listen, I don't see myself as artistic. It's not, innovation is not about art. It's about doing things in a new way. So if you can get a new twist on an existing idea, a new twist on an existing idea is innovation. So let's not sell ourselves too short, but innovation is definitely a key behavior of strategic thinkers. A couple of other behaviors of strategic thinkers, and this is probably one most commonly associated with people who think strategically. They consider and make short-term decisions within the context of the longer view. So if they're going to make a decision, I'm going to use a really innocent example. I'm going to think about what I'm going to have for lunch. Well, if I'm strategic at all, I'm also going to be thinking about the luncheon decision within the backdrop of, well, what did I have for breakfast, and what am I going to have for dinner, and what have I eaten this week, and what does the rest of the week look like? If I don't think strategically, I'm going to resemble the Goodyear blimp. So that's an ordinary example of using strategic thinking, short-term decision, but making it within a long-term context. That comment about political savvy that showed up in the last poll question, people who think strategically consider what their constituents are going to say, do, how they're going to react when decisions are made. And this ability to, first of all, have that insight into how the constituent groups are thinking, but more than that, leverage that, evaluate that future impact, that's a behavior of a strategic thinker. This last point is a little complex because you, first of all, have to have that knowledge, part of which comes from business acumen, part of which comes from being someone who can communicate, who can be influential, who can build relationships, but then you really have to think about that information in terms of the impact that it's going to have on their reactions. Now, earlier, Lark, you'd asked the question about how can we use strategic thinking in audit? I mean, what's the purpose of strategic thinking in audit? And so I gave you an example, which is on this slide. It's the second point on this slide. I gave you the example of planning individual audits, but I think that there are many more ways to use strategic thinking in internal audit. The first way, staff auditors and some lead auditors might not be involved in establishing the risk universe, carving up the entity, but strategically, it doing it in such a way that you can keep it evergreen. Let's face it, there's no one right way to carve up an organization. It's something that really does require an understanding of the organization itself, the lines of reporting, but thinking through, well, gee, if we carve up the business this way, how will that impact our ability to plan individual audits, to be able to break down the enterprise in such a way that it's meaningful and it facilitates individual audit planning, which is the second point on the slide. And I spoke about that earlier, so I'm not really going to say too much about that now. The third point, auditing organizational strategy, and I'm not sure if everyone is doing this, but if you remember in 2004 when COSO published its ERM model, and you thought about the changes that they made to that, the original integrated framework of control that was published in the early 90s, the goals that effective organizations had involved strategic goals, not just operational, regulatory compliance or financial and financial reporting goals. And when that model was introduced in 2004, it was a little controversial because many audit departments at the time questioned, well, should we really be auditing business strategy? Is that really, our place as auditors to audit something that is really so forward-thinking? Now, when you really look at it, it's not so much auditing the strategy per se as auditing the process by which the strategy is developed, that strategic planning process I mentioned earlier, and just as importantly, how is that strategic plan implemented? How is progress against that plan evaluated? So in thinking about how you want to tackle that, you definitely need to demonstrate strategic thinking. The fourth point on the slide, mirroring business leaders' future orientation, in order to be meaningful and to create meaningful results, I think we do need to get a seat at the table. We do need to be the go-to people to management. And when you're with senior leadership, I don't know if you've noticed it, but we spend a lot of time talking future, not just current state. And we talk about the past as a way to leverage so that we can be better in the future. So that I think it's important for auditors and people in risk management to model, demonstrate strategic thinking at every opportunity, but particularly when they are with senior leadership, because most business leaders are thinking ahead. We're thinking about, okay, where are we going to be in 2016? Where's revenue coming from? How can we take cost out of our business? Everything is future. So it's another way to use strategic thinking in auditing. For those of you leading audits, and one of your responsibilities is to come up with the draft of the audit report and figure out what are we reporting in that report. Well, as you think about the exceptions that were identified through testing, and then you think about, okay, were these exceptions reportable? Do they reflect breakdowns in the internal control environment? How do you want to communicate them? Do you want to report each individual item? Do you want to amalgamate them by theme? Now, the strategic thinking comes into play by anticipating what the reaction's going to be based on whether you report them individually or you report them by theme. That's where you get the boost or the bang from using strategic thinking. Are you going to garner more support for the issue, meaning repairing it or remediating it? That's where strategic thinking comes into play. Now, some of you might be thinking, gee, we need to do more data analysis. We need to do more data mining. Or, we still have not really automated our work papers. Well, this is another opportunity to demonstrate strategic thinking. And let me give you a specific example. If you're a strategic thinker, you would not only be thinking about automation's benefits for internal audit, but you would be thinking about how can we use automation to enhance communication across the second line of defense into the third line of defense, meaning how can we basically get better at communication between ERM, operational risk, compliance if you've got it, and internal audit, and the SOX teams. So you wouldn't just be thinking about automation for audit. If you're thinking strategically, you'd be thinking bigger picture. That's another example of using strategic thinking within an audit context. Of course, you could still think strategically in terms of how you could leverage software like ACL or IDEA, or even expand the way you're using Access and Excel within your department. Again, thinking a couple of steps ahead. And by the way, strategic thinkers also think through, well, what are we going to need to do to overcome any resistance or to bring people up to speed? That's that systematic attribute in strategic thinking. You're thinking about all of the components that are affected by the initiative. One of the last ideas for using strategic thinking within an audit context is, how do we come up with ways to recruit more talent, retain great talent? How do we onboard people in a way that enables them to get acclimated and acculturated, but also have that happen in a relatively quick and low-cost way? And think about all of the constituents within the organization that are impacted by this. So those are just a couple of ideas for using strategic thinking in an audit context. And so what I was going to focus on now is, okay, I think we've defined it, and we've talked about its benefits, its usefulness. How would I as an individual develop strategic thinking as a competency in me, and then also how can I develop strategic thinking as a core departmental competency? So let's look first at strategic thinking if you want to do it as an individual. Couple of thoughts. I think, first of all, if from a behavioral perspective, a habit is just a behavior that you do repeatedly. So you can cultivate a habit by deciding on a behavior that you want to practice and just doing it every time, every day, for a minimum of 30 consecutive days, and it will become a habit. So as you make decisions, and I'm sure each of you makes tons of decisions during the course of the day, simplest decision, do I work on this now? Do I work on that now? Just start asking yourself, okay, how will this help me? Now, on the slide, I have put in there, from a personal perspective, what's your long-range goal? Do you want to get promoted? What is it that you see in your heart for your career? You don't have to tell anybody. From a practical perspective, though, the long-range goal might not be so long-range. It might just be, what do I need to do, and how will this help me complete this audit more easily, more efficiently? But just train yourself to ask that question and answer it before you act on your decision. If you're not already doing it, I do think it's important to keep an eye on what your organization's competition is doing. And for those of you that are in nonprofits, you have competition too. I mean, donor dollars are not infinite. So just start becoming aware of who the marketplace perceives as your competition, and just make it a point to stay in tune with what's going on. Also stay in tune with what your key business partners are doing, the people that you audit. What's in their strategic plan? You might not be auditing their strategic process, but you can still pay attention to what is important to them in the long term. I don't know how much time you're making for networking, and when I'm talking about networking, I'm referring to more than just friending somebody or sending somebody an invitation to quote-unquote link in, but really cultivating it. Who are you reaching out to? Who are you regularly in communication with, either email or phone? Because that really will create some substance to your networking and really make your network even more valuable to you. I think it's really important to spot and study the strategic thinkers that you work with. They are around you. Just start listening with a third ear when you're at some of these meetings. These are the people that see opportunities that others don't see. And these are folks that are thinking, definitely thinking, several steps ahead. And they're definitely thinking about multiple objectives, not just one objective. But start to discern the behaviors that they demonstrate that make them strategic and start emulating them. Copy those behaviors. Make their behaviors your habits. The other technique I wanted to share with you as an individual is, and this is again, if you really want to build strategic thinking as a competency that you demonstrate, I think that it's important to come up with more than one option. I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits to strategic thinking is that it minimizes perfectionism. There is more than one way to scope an audit. There is more than one way to approach testing a control. There's more than one way to lay out the issue when you're communicating it to management, and these are all opportunities to practice strategic thinking. Now, for those of you that are interested in building strategic thinking in your organization, I think there's definitely some things that we can do. I think that we can make available or encourage people to use the SharePoints that are already set up within our organizations. I think that repeating and recommunicating the long-term goal for the team is important. I think getting individual auditors involved in projects that have a long-term view, forcing them to think bigger, I think is hugely important. The last point on this slide might be a little controversial in your areas, and I hesitated before I put it in my presentation, but I realized I would be remiss. SOX testing is very narrow. It's exceptionally narrow, and it narrows the skill set of folks who do operational audits. So if it's possible at all, make the strategic case for reducing the amount of SOX testing performed by the audit department, because really it's something that management should be doing, and it is cutting into the auditor's individual and collective ability to think more broadly. You might be surprised to see adopt risk-based auditing on this list, but there are departments that do risk-based to plan the annual audit plan, to plan the audits they're going to cover. And once they do that, there's no more risk thinking at the audit level, and I think that is a mistake. I think we really need to take this risk-based mentality and drive it throughout the audit as we plan it, as we think about how we're going to do our testing, as we rate our concerns. I think if we want to develop strategic thinking as a core competency within our department, we do need to give individuals access to folks who think strategically, folks who focus on the big picture. And as we're coaching, I definitely think that we need to coach in that area and let people know that was a strategic thought that you had, or help people be more strategic in their thinking. The last point on this slide, talking about centers of technical and business expertise, creating them, you might think, well, gee, how is this going to enhance strategic thinking? I see the value, but I don't see the value as it relates to strategic thinking. And I would urge you to look at it this way. In order to build that center of technical or business expertise, that individual needs to rub elbows with and interact with their business counterparts. And their business counterparts tend to be more future-oriented because they've got to drive the business. And that's the connection. That's how the individuals who are the centers of expertise within the audit department will build their strategic thinking ability. So I've given you a couple of ways you can build strategic thinking as an individual, a couple of ways you can build it in your organization. And now I thought it might be interesting to put some of this information into play. So I just finished talking about building bench strength for a department, making strategic thinking a core competency. So here's a polling question. What would you do? Imagine that you are trying to encourage and coach your team members to think strategically. And your team members tell you about a situation that occurred during the audit and how they propose to handle it. What would you say to coach them to think strategically? Would you say your approach is fine? Would you say what triggered the situation you were trying to deal with? Or would you say, how does your proposed solution relate to the audit objective?
And Anne, while people are thinking through that question, I have a related question based on some topics that you've been talking about, especially with networking. And this gentleman's asking, how can I use strategic thinking to strengthen my network?
So I think, how can you use strategic thinking to strengthen your network? I would almost say, how could you not? I don't mean to sound facetious, but I would start with, why do you want to build your network? What's the long-term view? Get that out there. That'll immediately get you thinking beyond just the now, just the current state. What do you want to achieve with your network? You might want to start thinking about how you want to use your network. You could also approach building your network by thinking about, I'm trying to find a nice word, but I can't really think of a nice word. I was just going to say a gap or a shortfall that you're trying to fill, or maybe there's some knowledge that you have or some exposure that you have now and you're trying to get more of that. What I'm getting at is, the first thing is, what's the goal? Preferably long-term goal. And so by establishing that, you are also using your strategic thinking capability. I think we do need to answer that question, though. And then I think once you have the answer to that question, who you reach out to and what you do to strengthen your network will become more readily apparent. So let's see what we did with the answer. So 72.5% of you got the right answer. Actually, it's the best answer. It's really the best answer. How does your proposed solution relate to the audit objective? And it's the best answer because it's causing the performers to consider their short-term response in view of a bigger picture, which is the audit objective. And that, having that mental ability to think, okay, short-term, and what is that going to do, bigger picture or longer term, that is an example of strategic thinking. The B answer, what triggered the situation you're trying to deal with, that is an excellent answer if you were trying to coach for critical thinking. Because one form of critical thinking is root cause analysis. So that B answer, for those of you that chose that one, what triggered the situation, that's causing the performer to think about, well, what caused that situation, and would the answer that they're coming up with address the cause? So it's not about coaching question. It's just not a coaching question for strategic thinking. It's more for critical thinking. And, your approach is fine. That's hardly coaching. I mean, it's coaching insofar as it's recognition, it's approval, it's a green light, but there's no amplification to let the practitioner know, well, gee, should I replicate this behavior? Should I continue doing this? So it's a little bit of a missed opportunity if you picked A. I think whoever picked A, it was probably an oopsie when you hit the button. You probably didn't really mean to pick that one. So I've got another scenario for you, another case for you to see how well you apply what we've been talking about in this webinar. This is going to cause you to have to imagine that the year is 1850, and imagine that you are a wealthy business person and you own a department store in New York City. By the way, if you don't like New York City, you can make it any town that you want. But it's better if it's on the East Coast, and you'll see why in a minute. Business is booming. You are selling everything. But you would like business to boom more. Now, some of your family and friends have moved to San Francisco, and they are really, really upset because in 1850, they don't have a wonderful store like yours. They just don't have that department store. Now, what happens is you send them whatever they ask for. You know, they communicate with you via telegraph. Now, your business partner wants to put together a catalog listing everything that you sell, but the Pony Express wants to charge $5 an ounce rate. So sending this weighty book is really kind of making you hesitate. So the question is, what should you do? That's the question. And so here's the poll question. What should you do? Should you save the money and allocate it into advertising in the tri-state area for New York? Would you send the catalogs? Would you tell your West Coast customers to recommend your company's merchandise to others to generate sales? They can telegraph their orders too. So I'm getting you now to think outside the box of audit and risk management and come up with your answer.
And Ann, while people are answering this particular polling question, there's a question that came in related to an earlier content in the webinar. And this person's asking, what organizations have you seen be successful at auditing organization strategy?
I have seen a couple, and the reason they're successful at it is they're not auditing the strategy itself, meaning they're not auditing, gee, should we be looking to grow organically 20% a year? They're not auditing that. They're auditing the process of strategic planning, and they're auditing how well these strategic plans are being implemented. And it's really, at the risk of oversimplifying it, because it's really a slightly different topic, but at the risk of oversimplifying it, start thinking about weaving these data collection questions into your all of your audits, so that you're asking questions about their process, you're evaluating that process, you're evaluating what they're doing against that process, and it's really easier than you think to at least begin to audit that strategic planning process. So let's see what you came up with. And so almost 58% of you said tell your West Coast customers to recommend your company's merchandise. And that's definitely something that you can do. Best answer. All the answers are viable, by the way. All the answers are viable. Best answer, send the catalogs, because people are going to want to look through the catalogs. They'll keep the catalogs. I definitely would also tell your West Coast customers to recommend, but it's easier to recommend once they've purchased. And a lot of people like to see something. Keep in mind, it's 1850. They didn't have the Internet then. You could always save the money, but you're definitely not strategically. You're not going to get that boom, because that's going to be an extension of what you're doing. So I know I put you in a different position there, getting you thinking about sales instead of auditing, but that's also part of thinking strategically, starting to imagine what is going to happen. So I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for some questions. And before we start taking some questions, I just wanted to also leave you with a thought. Without strategy, execution is aimless, and without execution, strategy is useless. And if you've ever gotten an email from me, I have a similar quote in my signature box, vision without execution is a hallucination, and I really do believe that. So we have, I guess, about 3 minutes or so left. So are there any questions, Lork, that we should be talking about?
Yes, there's one particular question we're going to start off with, and we'll see if we have time for another one. But this gentleman's asking that if you have a team that is used to compliance-based thinking, what is the best way to change their culture, their mindset, so that they start thinking strategically?
So if we have people that are used to that compliance, yes, no, binary kind of thinking, I think a couple of things have to happen, and not necessarily in this order because I'm thinking off the top of my head. First of all, I think we have to let people know that the music is changing and that what good looks like is changing, and the rationale for why what good looks like is changing. And what I mean by good looking like, most people when they take a job, they want to know, what do you expect of me? And they got hired at some point, I have to believe they got hired with the understanding that binary thinking, compliance thinking was what good looked like. So I think the starting point is to share with people the tempo is changing, the music is changing, good now looks like this. And that means getting people used to shades of gray in their decision making, really starting to make decisions about what's high, what's medium, what's low, what's good, what's not good, getting them used to that. I think you're going to need to be patient. I think you're going to have to break this into some components because some people might need some training. I would also look at your manual, your internal audit manual. How clear is that? What kind of guidance are we giving people? I'm not saying to be prescriptive. I'm not saying to give them rules, but I am specifically using the word guidance. What are some factors that they should consider? So it's going to be a project. It'll probably take you at least a couple of years to move the group, but stay with it. Definitely stay with it.
Well, thank you, Ann. We're at the top of the hour. Again, we filled the hour with a lot of good content, so thank you for spending time with us today. So go ahead and conclude the webinar. And for those of you who attended, thank you very much for attending. We will be issuing CPE certificates via email following the event within 2 weeks. And then please do fill out the evaluation that's available when you're exiting the webinar. We do like your feedback. We'd like to see how we did and if you have any suggestions for us in the future. So have a great Friday, and we'll talk to you all later.